The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
An innocent death row inmate has been denied compensation money after spending 30 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. WHAS 11 is reporting that when Glenn Ford walked out of prison for the first time in 30 years, he had a state-issued debit card for $20. His prison account had 24 cents in it, and that everything he owned fit into 2 cardboard boxes. Until he was freed, he, 65 years old, Mr. Ford, Glenn Ford, had been one of the longest-serving death row inmates in the United States. He was convicted in 1984, the year I was born, then exonerated of first-degree murder after a new informant came forward and cleared him of the crime. His former lawyer, Gary Clements, was by his side on his first day of freedom, and he said that, he doesn't really, he didn't even seem angry. Ford didn't even seem angry. He just seemed glad to be out. And we now found out that even though he would be eligible for as much as $330,000 in compensation payments, when he petitioned for the money, a judge denied his request, saying, okay, Ford didn't kill the individual that he was originally convicted of having killed, but he wasn't completely innocent because he may have known about the shooting beforehand because of communication with other people. Let's not ignore $330,000 for 30 years is absurdly low, right? To begin with, even estimating only a $35,000 a year salary, that's over $1 million plus interest that he should be entitled to, plus damages to make up for losing 30 years of his life. Conservatively speaking, we're talking about many millions of dollars that he should be entitled to. This is based on the judge's opinion about the case, right? He may have known about the crime beforehand. He was not convicted of that. He was convicted of having committed the crime, and he did not commit the crime, and thus he has been exonerated. And the judge's opinion about what he may or may not have known has not been proven by the law. This is just all around. It seems like a very feeble attempt here to try to maintain some level of guilt associated guilt with the exonerated man.
Yeah, I hope that this will be fought. I'd like to think that there's still a chance that there will be some type of meaningful compensation. But I don't know. What state is this in?
This is, I forget offhand where it is.
Yeah, well, that could have something to do with it. But it's, I'm sure he's thrilled to be out of prison and out of death row. But what do you do now?
He currently survives on donations. He's cared for by a staff of volunteers, including John Thompson, who's another exonerated prisoner who operates a sort of home for exonerees. Very sad story. And I mean, just every aspect of our incarceration system needs reform and has these remarkable and preposterous instances of injustice in it. Yeah,
it's really, really bad. It's amazing that he was on death row for so long.
Yeah,
that's the incredible thing. I mean, I think another example of why we need to do away with capital punishment.
Thousands of women and children are forced into marriage every single year in the United States. Not exactly the country you might imagine would be having that problem. Layli Miller-Muro, executive director of the Tahiri Justice Center, issued a statement about forced marriage, about thousands of women forced into marriage in the United States. Tahiri recently documented 3,000 forced marriages in the U.S. during a 2-year period. And the craziest part about all of this is that the victims a lot of times have little recourse because American law on this at its core is not really set up to deal with forced marriage. Quote, some of our clients have actually committed suicide as their only way out. They've been beaten. They have been imprisoned in their own home. They've been starved. If there isn't a history of violence in the relationship, Miller-Muro says that there's often very little that can be done. Quote, the parents can go to a court and get a marriage certificate, indicate that they're waiving the minimum age requirement for a kid, and the court has no procedures in place to ensure the child is wanting this, and so we've seen this happen. The Tahiri Justice Center has documented forced marriage in almost every single U.S. state, among many communities with ties to dozens of different countries and many religions. So this applies to very Orthodox Jewish communities. This applies to very devout Muslim communities. This applies to these Christian sects. This applies to individuals that are more tied to specific countries of origin rather than particular religions. I don't even know what can be done. It's one of those cases, Lewis, where the law does not reflect the reality of the situation and is basically ill-equipped to deal with it.
And perhaps if Congress wasn't so focused on trying to prevent gay people from getting married, perhaps they could pass some type of meaningful legislation that would help deal with this situation.
Yeah, forced child marriages, and instead we're trying to prevent two adult consenting men, for example, from getting married to each other. And you might say, well, just criminalized forced marriage, let's just get it over with. Even that would be kind of complicated. It could be counterproductive because it might discourage girls from seeking help if they know that now they're dealing with police involvement when it comes to criminalized forced marriage. This is a pretty tough situation, and it's just horrible.
Even if you say that perhaps both parties must consent and you come up with some type of framework for that, I mean, we're talking about young kids who,
that's
might
the
not
thing.
be able.
The parents decide. The parents consent for them.
Exactly. So even if you were to make it so that the child must consent, the pressure from the parents and the leverage they have, who knows, they might be completely mentally broken. They might have no choice anyway.
A federal judge has given final approval to a class action lawsuit settlement involving the NFL, the National Football League, and thousands of former players, according to the league. We've been dealing with the NFL concussion crisis for a while now. This agreement would provide up to $5 million per retired player for serious medical conditions associated with repeated head trauma. So basically, it depends on, of the 5,000 ex-NFL players that have brought this lawsuit forward, depending on their condition, they get different amounts of money. So like if you have Alzheimer's, you might get 3.5 million. If you have something else, it might only be 500,000, et cetera, et cetera. The NFL said that the players and their families would be eligible for prompt and substantial benefits. Initially, there was this $765 million figure placed on the total settlement, but a judge said, it's not clear that that's going to be enough here, so we need to uncap this entire thing and just have all of the money available and potentially disbursable here. What's going to happen with football? I mean, every month we have new evidence about the damage that football does. We increasingly have concerns about the liability for the college programs. We have a player recently who we discussed who decided to retire almost immediately from the NFL as a rookie to save his mind and his body from the future possible trauma of playing football. Are we really going to see football still played in the way that we see it played now in 15 years?
I think we are. Unfortunately, I think what's going to happen is over time, and perhaps more than 15 years, those NFL arenas are going to turn into the old school arenas like the Coliseum, where you have people from poor communities seeing it as a way out of poverty. People who have incredible athletic ability will pursue that and, hopefully make it big. So I think football, it's the number one sport in the country right now. I think it's going to be a long time before we see that change.
However, if we do start seeing these settlements worrying the top college football programs, obviously you can still have professional football without college football. But if you eliminate college football, you're also going to impact the desire and the desire of parents of high schoolers to allow them to play football because, hey, you can't get that college scholarship anymore and the chances of going to the NFL are so small. There could be a big impact here.
That would be bad. I mean, imagine these players going straight from high school to the NFL, you get banged up, you get injured 2 years in, then what do you do?
2 TSA officers have been fired for a groping scheme at Denver International Airport. This is a scheme in which these 2 officers would have another TSA officer signal them when they would signal each other essentially. If one of the officers saw a guy that they wanted to pat down because they found the guy attractive, they would kind of send a signal. I don't know what signal it was, pulling the earlobe or slapping themselves in the face, who knows. And then another officer would randomly select them for an additional screening. And Denver police got involved in this a little while ago. They observed the employees and they figured out, yes, indeed, they have been doing this. They've been fired, but there will be no criminal charges because none of the victims have actually come forward. I've talked many times about how I don't go through the porno scanner. They tell you, oh, there's no radiation anymore. And, the files aren't stored. The images aren't stored anywhere, whatever. I don't care. I go through the metal detector. And if there's no metal detector that day available, I'll get the pat down. What was your reaction to this, Lewis? I know you typically get a pat down, but sometimes if you're just annoyed and tired or whatever, you'll just go through the porno scanner. Does this make you more skittish about pat downs?
It doesn't. No, to be honest, I really wouldn't care if they. I think some of these people who fell victims of this probably didn't even know that they were being groped. They probably just thought this is a rather aggressive pat down.
Well, I guess the difference was, how they're always supposed to pat down the sensitive areas around the genitals with the back of the hand. I guess they were using the front of the hand, which allows a different level of kind of tactile investigation, exploration.
Now, I've had so many pat downs that, of course, I would be, that would be a red flag to me. I would know that was not proper procedure. But would I really care, or would I just want to get on with my flight? I don't really know. Would it be worth the hassle in making a scene?
Yeah, I don't know. So in the last 6 weeks, I've flown to Phoenix and to Las Vegas. And both times, my girlfriend and I both have TSA pre-check, which is supposed to be, you don't take off your shoes, you don't have to open your bag or take your laptop out. You just put your metal stuff in a little container. Everything goes through and you go through a metal detector. Both times, my girlfriend got randomly selected for screening. And it's just such a ruse. I mean, even the pat down itself is not very extensive, and it's still invasive. Like they were looking in her pants and checking her bra and all sorts of stuff. But still, she came away feeling like it felt very invasive, and at the same time, it didn't seem that thorough. Like I still could have brought stuff with me.
Right, but that's the system. I've been thinking about signing up for that pre-check, but I haven't been stuck in any long lines lately, so maybe it's not even worth it.
For me, it's not about the line. Sometimes the line is, 2% of what the general line is, but I pack my stuff in a way where if I have to take my backpack out and all my liquids and all this stuff every single time, because as you remember, Lewis, I carry on my bag. I try not to check the bag. That's really the big pain.
Yeah, well, I can understand that. I always bring my carry-on too. Maybe. I don't know. If those lines keep getting worse, I think I'll have to do the pre-check.
On today's bonus show, we'll talk about automated bartenders. We will talk about using tamed HIV to cure disease. And we'll talk about an artificial photosynthesis breakthrough. Might not sound that exciting, but it is a huge, huge accomplishment. All of that and more on the bonus show, davidpakman.com/membership.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Our program is funded by you, members of our audience, through the membership program, which you can sign up for at davidpakman.com/membership. Today's new member of the day is Cesar Robles. Cesar, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. In addition to signing up at davidpakman.com/membership, if you ever shop on Amazon.com, the shopping you do can send our show a kickback if you first go to davidpakman.com and click on the Amazon banner on the right side of the page. Big announcement next week, Lewis. Big announcement. Hope everybody is standing by for that. Lewis, very excited over there. I know you talked it down on Monday, but now you're wound up for it, right?
Huge announcement. Huge. Everyone should probably wear a diaper when they hear it.
3 years ago this week, Joe Biden told a crowd that President Obama has a big stick.
Now is the time to heed the timeless advice from Teddy Roosevelt. Speak softly and carry a big stick. End of quote. I promise you, the president has a big stick. I promise you.
This is one of my favorite Joe Biden clips. He really seemed to have no idea how funny it would sound, and he has a wealth of memorable gaffes at this point.
Yeah, the big stick was one of the best, but there have been many noteworthy ones.
I liked when he said, look, John McCain's last-minute economic plan does nothing to tackle the number one job facing the middle class, and it happens to be, as Barack says, a three-letter word, jobs, J-O-B-S, jobs. On Obama, Joe said, you got the first mainstream African-American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice-looking guy. I mean, that's a storybook, man. He also once called President Obama Barack America. He was trying to praise Delaware's Indian American population. And he said, you can't go to a 7-Eleven or a Dunkin' Donuts unless you have a slight Indian accent. I'm not joking. Of course, there's when he said this is a big effing deal. And then we can't ignore all of the times he's awkwardly touched or kissed politicians' wives or daughters or whoever.
Yeah, he is a very awkward guy. But, you know, I like Joe. He's just kind of a character who's always hanging around and doing things that make us laugh.
My favorite thing about Joe Biden is actually just how people reacted when he debated Paul Ryan. And Paul Ryan was just lying. And Joe Biden was laughing. And right-wing media went crazy about how disrespectful it was that Joe Biden was laughing, ignoring that Paul Ryan lied through the entire debate.
Yeah, some people even accused Joe Biden of being senile.
That's right. Yeah. Oh, Dr. Keith Abloh, who is the Fox News psychiatrist, said that while he hadn't personally evaluated Joe Biden, which I think we all knew, that we have to be thinking about whether dementia was at play. I mean, just insane that the reaction to that debate showed us just how Joe Biden wiped the floor with Paul Ryan.
Yeah, for all the gaffes and ridiculous moments, he actually did pretty well during those debates.
2 years ago this week, it was just after the Boston Marathon bombing, and David Ortiz, Boston Red Sox player, uttered the F-bomb when talking on live television when addressing the crowd at Fenway Park. Let me remind you what that sounded like.
This is our f***ing city. And nobody gonna dictate our freedom.
Yeah, I love that clip. The FCC saying, hey, you know what? We're actually okay with David Ortiz using the F word, because it was something he said from the heart, and it wasn't planned ahead of time, I guess. And the reality is that none of these swears are a big deal. And it was so obvious that the FCC was not going to be caught in the politically sticky situation of criticizing a player who was just talking about how horrible it was that there was this bombing at the Boston Marathon. I think it was more a political decision from the FCC, but I actually think they should never get fined for swearing on television. It's this kind of puritanical standard that we have for media in this country, which doesn't exist in many countries around the world. And no kids' lives have been ruined by hearing swears.
Right. Should we just stop regulating words and let the free market decide? Perhaps that's a good approach to swearing.
If you were to call Dahar Tsarnaev an effing a-hole right now, and it went out, I mean, I guess it's different because it's not live, right? Our affiliates would air it later. Arguably, you were also just speaking from the heart, though.
Yeah, and speaking factually from the heart. Yeah, but I don't think I would be subject to the same leniency. I mean, I know I wouldn't. We would get hit with a fine if they discovered it.
Let's stop regulating words. Let's stop regulating body parts. Remember the entire hubbub around Janet Jackson's breast at the Super Bowl, which I think is like 10 years ago or maybe even more. It's crazy how long it's been. We just need to get off of this altogether.
I agree. It's holding us back. I feel like we're in the Stone Age.
1 year ago this week, Cliven Bundy, tax evading Nevada rancher Cliven Bundy, told Alex Jones that Sean Hannity was his hero. If your head didn't explode over how mind-blowingly stupid and outrageous that sounded, we can continue to focus on the language that was used. It seems that in right-wing conservative culture, words like hero, idol, legend, and patriot are used really liberally. Wouldn't you say, Lewis?
Yeah, they throw those words around I mean, how ridiculous is that? Cliven Bundy saying that Sean Hannity is his hero. It's just incredible.
I wonder, though, if it's calculated or unintentional that they use these words so liberally. Because on the one hand, we know that the right has been very good at framing language. We've talked about tax relief, being pro-life when you're actually not, if your position is that you're against abortion and teaching reasonable sex ed. So we could say, well, it could be calculated that they use these words about patriots and idols and heroes. At the same time, it seems that they don't even realize how the words have completely lost any weight because of their overuse.
That is true. It's such an important part of their dialogue. They try to make themselves sound like the party of heroes and legends and patriots and the real Americans. But, sometimes I hear them say things like this, and I just think about little kids talking about how, Superman is their hero and their idol. And it just, it sounds silly to me.
I actually do get bummed out when I think about how much better Republicans have been at framing language than Democrats around so many issues. And we interviewed George Lakoff extensively about this because he's written now 2 books about it. And if you didn't see that interview, you should really check it out. It's very, very good. He's just such an expert in this. It does bum me out that Republicans have been successfully able to take such idiotic ideas, but pair them with strong language framing, and they've completely upended people's opinions about what's logical.
Yeah, and I think when you use language the way they have, it's kind of like advertising in a way. I mean, a lot of those the most effective ad campaigns of all time are just these simple, stupid things that resonate with people. And I think they've somehow done the same thing.
Coming up next is our interview with Pulitzer winner Michael Moss. Fascinating interview. Later on, we will answer your audience questions. Big announcement coming next week. I say that you should be very prepared to be shocked and appalled by the announcement we're going to make. Although maybe appalled isn't the right word, Louis.
Shock and awe.
And you will be in shock and awe. I think that is better. Yeah, big announcement next week. Great show today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
In the last couple of years, there's been so much more research done into the addictive nature of sugar and comparing and contrasting the addictiveness of sugar versus some hard drugs. And there's a huge wake-up happening around sugar and sugary foods. And for today's classic interview, we're going to go back to May 6th of 2013, where we spoke to Michael Moss, who's a Pulitzer-winning investigative reporter from the New York Times, about his book. And it talks about food, it talks about sugar, and so many other things. And it's really a great, great interview, and particularly relevant given the scientific revelations of the last, 6 to 12 months. Let's get right into it. Michael Moss is the Pulitzer Prize winning investigative reporter at the New York Times. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, Sugar, Salt, Fat: How the Food Giants Hooked Us. Michael, really a pleasure to talk to you. And there's just so much in your book that I was very interested in. And I picked out a few things that I think might be interesting to focus on today. One that I want to talk about is when companies like Kraft and a lot of these other players that we're very familiar with in the processed food industry started to see study after study linking the sugar, salt, and fat-laden foods clearly to obesity. How did they react?
Well, within these largest companies, there are actually, and this surprised me, cabals of insiders who became increasingly alarmed, not just from like a social policy standpoint, but also just from fear of losing the public trust. And early on in my research for the book, I came across this extraordinary meeting way back in 1999. These insiders brought together the CEOs of some of the largest manufacturers in North America to talk about none other than the emerging obesity, diabetes, etc. epidemic. And they stood up before these CEOs and made this incredible pitch. A senior official from Kraft gets up and armed with 114 slides, lays at their feet responsibility for the obesity crisis and even links their foods with several cancers and pleads with them to do the right thing by consumers.
And what was the reaction to that pleading?
You know, from his perspective, the meeting was an utter failure. I mean, he even went so far as to warn them that the lawyers who went after big tobacco, it wasn't just a matter of if, but when they were going to come after big food with the same arguments, that there are health effects from overconsumption of salt, sugar, fat, that the industry's over-reliance on these ingredients has contributed to the epidemic, and that the lawyers will come after that, if nothing else, to recover some of the public health care costs associated with obesity. The CEOs reacted defensively. They said, look, we already offer consumers of choice. We have in the grocery store products, versions of our mainline products that are low fat, low sugar, have added grains. We do respond to the consumers, but we're also beholden to shareholders. We must keep our prices low. We must make our food tasty in order to sell product. And
which is basically a reaction that says, while we may understand the connection between our products and the diseases you're talking about, we also have a responsibility to shareholders, which pushes back against the social responsibility you're talking about. I mean, is that not essentially what that answer means?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's essentially, too, also just a certain amount of denial when inside these companies. I spent time with the former president of Coca-Cola for North America, South America. And at one time, at one point he said to me, look, Michael, and by the way, he is now out there selling fresh carrots, doing what he calls karmic debt for the 20 years. He was one of Coke's fiercest warriors. And he said to me, look, Michael, when you're inside the company in your day-to-day battle with competitors, in their case, Pepsi, you're just not sort of seeing the big picture, not wanting to see the big picture. So it's not as if these companies and their employees are evil empires intentionally setting out to get us overweight or otherwise ill. They're companies doing what companies do, which is make as much money as possible by selling as much product as possible.
Talk a little bit about the bliss point. In the book, Salt, Sugar, Fat, you talk about the bliss point, and I think that that's a concept that would be interesting to our audience.
I was really stunned at the amount of science, they call it engineering, that goes into creating new foods. Bliss point is the term that the industry came up with to describe the perfect formula of sweetness in foods that would send us over the moon, guarantee high sales for them. A legend in the industry named Howard Moskowitz, trained in high math, experimental psychology at Harvard, walked me through his recent creation of a new soda flavor for Dr. Pepper. And to achieve the bliss point, the perfect sort of formulation, he started with 61 different formulations of sweetness, each one just slightly different than the other, subjected those to 3,000 consumer taste tests, threw the data into his computer, did his high math regression analysis thing, and came up with a very perfect formula that would wow us and guarantee the company a hit.
And when you say, I'm sorry, go ahead, yeah.
No, I was just going to say, and what's fascinating about sugar is that we don't have an endless desire for sugar. Anybody who drinks coffee and likes it sweet can do the experiment themselves. Just keep adding sugar till you get to the point where you really like it. Keep adding more, and eventually you'll go, yuck, this is awful. So the bliss point typically is calculated. The data is on a chart that looks like a bell-shaped curve, where at the very top of the curve, not too little, not too much, is the perfect amount of sugar and sweetness.
So before we talk a little about the implications of that kind of food engineering, the other fascinating thing in the book, of many, is your salt story, right? This story about, well, when you look at the back of a can of soup or whatever it is, I'm always shocked by the amount of sodium that it has. And I say, why couldn't they just make the same product, but just put less salt in it? It'll be healthier. And will people really miss it if it's salty and not incredibly salty? But you actually know about why that doesn't work.
I had the exact same question. And the answer is basically they are more hooked on salt than we are. And to demonstrate that, for me, some of the largest companies, Kraft, Campbell Soup, and especially Kellogg, made for me some of their icons without salt added. I went to Battle Creek, Michigan, research and development headquarters of Kellogg, and started tasting some of these icons with their people. And I'd have to tell you, it was the most god-awful experience I ever had. We started with the Cheez-Its crackers, which normally I could eat all day long. These we couldn't even swallow. They stuck to the roof of our mouth. Without salt, they lacked texture, solubility. The frozen waffles were even worse. We popped them in the toaster. They came out looking and tasting like straw. And the clincher was the cornflakes. Put it in, we put in the bowl with some milk and tasted. Before I could say anything, the chief spokeswoman for the company got this look of a horror on her face, and she swallowed and blurted out the word metal, M-E-T-A-L. I taste metal, and the chief scientist is sitting there going, yeah, well, that's one of the beauties of salt for us, is that it will mask some of the off notes, the bad flavors that can creep into some food processing.
So is that really the source of this, Michael, which is in everyday cooking, if you're using kind of whole ingredients, you don't need salt to cover the fact that the ingredients have been processed? Is that really why the salt is there? It's not as a preservative as we often hear.
Right. Well, in fact, being a preservative is the other thing that it's incredibly useful to, too. Is that when you cook for yourself, it doesn't have to sit in your refrigerator for 2 months at a time. I talked to a meat maker who actually has really low sodium salt in their products. I said, why? And they go, well, actually, because we make our meat for the deli counter, not the grocery store aisle. So it has a 7-day lifespan. So yeah, preservative. The other incredible, brilliant thing about salt to the industry, it's really low cost, 10 cents a pound. They can use it to avoid using more costly ingredients like fresh herbs and spices.
Last thing, and we don't have too much time here, which I'm curious to get your take on, is has the consumption of these processed foods, which have so much salt and these finely tuned bliss points of sugar, has this kind of changed the standard of people's palates and how normal food is judged, such that it's completely skewing our perception of what food is?
Oh, absolutely. And scientists, even within the food industry, are alarmed at the way, for example, sweetness has migrated through the grocery store, out of the dessert aisle, through the rest of the store, and is teaching kids to expect sweetness in almost everything. Bread is now sweet. Yogurt can have as much sugar in it as ice cream. Pasta sauces can have the equivalent of a couple of Oreo cookies in a half-cup serving of pasta sauce. And that sort of, especially with sugar, but also fat and salt, sort of the extent to which the processed food industry has helped shape our desire for and our expectation for large amounts of these three ingredients is part of the issue that the public health system is now struggling with.
Well, the book, once again, is Sugar, Salt, Fat, How the Food Giants Hooked Us. We've been speaking with the book's author, Michael Moss. Really great to have you on. Fascinating. I encourage our audience to check out the book.
Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's time for audience questions. Every Friday, we answer 3 questions from the audience. Submit them however you want. You can email us. You can call our voicemail number, 219-2DAVID-P. First question from Heather. Who will be the first Republican candidate to drop out of the campaign? Well, I think we have to sort of answer this based on the people that are running so far. And I think amongst the candidates currently running on the Republican side, the first to drop out is going to be, let's see, do I think it's Ted Cruz, Rand Paul, or Marco Rubio? I think it's going to be Marco Rubio. And the reason I say that is I think he's running for vice president, whereas I think Ted Cruz has even less of a chance than Marco Rubio. I just think Ted Cruz is not running for vice president. He's not going to have any chance at being the nominee either. He just wants to stay in this thing as long as possible for fundraising purposes. So I think it's going to be Marco Rubio, and I know that I could be drastically wrong. He may end up staying really late, but I'm just basing that on my idea that he's running for VP.
I think that that's probably going to be the case as well. I also happen to think he's the most incompetent of all the candidates at the moment. Probably there's just something very weird and awkward, and seemingly he just seems to me like he exudes this like inexperience almost. And I don't know, he just doesn't seem very presidential to me. I think people will see that.
Rand Paul, there's a case to be made that Rand Paul is just going to realize that he doesn't have the ability to raise the money he needs, and the small donors that were often the trademark of his father, Ron Paul, in these campaigns are just not going to get him too far. So you could make a pretty strong case that it's going to be Rand Paul of these three candidates, but I'm going to stick with Marco Rubio. Sometimes there's an advantage. If you're raising money, even if you know you're not going to win, sometimes there's an advantage just to sticking it out, because then you can, I believe, transfer money raised in a presidential campaign to then if you have a re-election for Senate or House or other races. So sometimes there's an advantage to staying in, even as a completely non-viable candidate.
Yeah, I think perhaps if Chris Christie runs, he may be the first to drop out, but we have yet to hear that announcement.
Let's go to the next question from Carmen. We've got a couple more philosophical questions, Lewis. One from Carmen is ignorance really bliss? There's so much that could really be said about this, and the idea being that the less aware you are about the realities of the world and bad things going on, and the more simple-minded you are, the more blissful you are, because you just are aware of less, you're aware of fewer things that are concerning, and you're just less likely to get upset about stuff that's going on in the world. Now, in practice, do you think that actually holds true?
I think it can. I think if we're talking about people who, let's say people who have their lives in order, who you have a job, your bills are paid, you live comfortably, but we're talking about everything else that's happening in the world, let's say politically. I think for people like that, ignorance can truly be bliss.
So you're kind of saying all else being equal, given similar circumstances, just having a lack of idea of the world can actually lead to you being, now is it happier or just more satisfied with life?
I think happier, because I think if you are unaware of what's happening in the world and perhaps what's happening in your own country, maybe even politically, I think you can be in a blissful state. And I think perhaps for a lot of those people, if they were to learn about the realities of what's happening around them, it would adversely affect them. Now, on the other side, I think if you are a person who is ignorant about the things happening in your own life and around you and the things you are doing, I would say that ignorance might not be bliss, because if the things you are doing, the things you surround yourself with are making you unhappy, are making your life more difficult, and you don't realize it, you continue to do those things, and, well, you were probably not in a blissful state.
I read an article last week which suggests that studies show if you're more clever, and it's interesting that the article used this word, if you're more clever, you're more likely to experience general anxiety, as well as kind of more existential type anxiety. And so it was kind of interesting to see the term cleverness used. If I step back for a second, I can understand why. If you know that ultimately the sun is going to burn out and the planet is no longer going to be habitable, that's a fact which at best it doesn't cause you any stress or anxiety, but it actually might. So we could identify all sorts of fact-based beliefs which could only serve to make people less happy. So in that sense, I do understand the concept of ignorance is bliss. And you know what? I talk to a lot of people who live what they describe as very simple lives, and they're not very curious about other things or other parts of the world, and they really do seem very happy.
I think it's interesting watching some of those documentaries that try to tackle happiness. And I guess many of the world's happiest people, at least so we're led to believe, are kind of isolated. And and aren't really exposed to what is happening everywhere else. So yeah, I think it can be true that ignorance is bliss.
Send me your thoughts on this one. Is there another angle that we're not thinking about here? Last question today is from Anya. Anya wrote in and said, is it really better to try and fail than not to try at all? So hoping to break down another one of these catchphrases. It's better to have tried and failed than to have never tried at all. There's two sides to this. And, we've been talking about the upcoming announcement for the show. And this thought process is kind of a factor in what we're thinking about as far as next steps for the show, to kind of preview what we're going to be discussing next week. If you, there's no question that when I think about the potential to do something and I say, you know what, it might not be the right thing. Sometimes it seems better to just know for sure whether something would have been good or not. Even if it's not good, at least you figured it out, right? So I can certainly get behind that. At the same time, I am someone who believes in due diligence, and I don't believe in just trying any crazy notion and saying anything that comes to mind. It's better to try it and fail than not to try at all, because you can do some pretty serious long-term damage to your life, be it financially, be it physically, depending on saying, wait, I want to try this or that. So as a general rule, I find more satisfaction in knowing whether something was or was not a good idea by trying it. But I still am someone who does due diligence, and I think carefully about the choices I make.
I was basically going to say the exact same thing. In most cases, I would say that yes, it's better to try some physical challenge that isn't outrageous. There's someone you're interested in, some man or woman that you really like, and you want to try and woo them. Okay, yeah, it's probably worth a shot. Or there's I don't know, some place you want to visit in the world. I don't know. Any number of things. But when it comes to let's say you want to open a business, let's say, I've always wanted to own a bar. Better to try that than not try at all? Well, maybe not.
It's a fair question. Should everyone who thinks of opening a restaurant definitely try it, given the fact that something like 90% of restaurants fail within the first 5 years? Maybe not. I don't know. I guess the question would be, is that something you truly want to do? And I think it comes down to this question ultimately. Will wondering if something would have worked or been a positive thing and not knowing be a more negative thing than trying and failing? So for example, for me, I'm somewhat curious about what it would be like to do one of those insane, Tough Mudder races or something like that, where you walk over fire and people are getting hurt and projectile vomiting all over the place. I have somewhat of a curiosity as to what it would be like to do that. But for me, the curiosity of it and not really knowing what it would be like does not even nearly outweigh what I think would be the just very unpleasant realities of doing it. So I've opted not to do that. Am I curious? Hey, I might try and fail. What would it be like? Sure, I'm a little bit curious. But when I weigh it on balance, it just doesn't override that for me. And I think most people can make kind of a very simple equation or inequality type comparison here. Yeah.
Perhaps the better question is, will you regret not trying it? Will you regret not trying it? And that's something I tell people.
Yeah, the word regret is not in the question, but the question is really all about regret.
Yeah, that is. So perhaps that's a better metric. But if it's something that is, negligible financially or physically or mentally, if it's something that you can recover from if you fail, of course it's better to try it.
And there's a lot to be said, actually, about even in failure, there is a lot of learning, right? If you figure out that path A is a disaster, as long as you come out of it in a way that doesn't destroy you physically or financially or emotionally, you've probably learned a huge amount.
Yeah, of course. Failing and learning, that's a big part of life. So, it's a great question.
If you accidentally had a kid and it turned out you didn't love the kid, it would be sad, but you would have learned a huge life lesson, Lewis.
I would have learned to make sure never to have another kid.
Yeah, that's for damn sure.
That's an important lesson.
Yeah. All right, we will talk to you on the bonus show. Keep the questions coming. Make sure to sign up at davidpakman.com/membership. Very exciting bonus show today and huge announcement about the show next week.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.